All right. Welcome to the Town of Hudson Planning Board meeting for March 23rd, 2018. Yep. Problem?
You're coming out of the speakers on the TV, sir.
Ah, okay. We're turning the volume down on the TV. Wonderful. Thank you. And that one is okay over there. All right, Mr. Vanderveen, would you lead us in the pledge, please?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Oz, would you call the roll?
Delmarca.
Here.
Mr. Rowley. Here. Mr. Overy.
Over here.
Mr. Moran.
Here.
Mr. Vanderveen.
Here.
And Mr. Meinhold.
Here. Let's see, we are, Mr. Brackett is not here. And
Mr. Dumont.
Mr. Dumont is not here, so I will seat both Mr. Vanderveen and Mr. Meinhold as full voting members tonight. Okay. We have a set of minutes from April 25th. Has anybody had a chance to read them?
Motion to accept.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Malley. Motion by Mr. Ulrey to accept. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Very good, thank you. The first thing we have is, we don't have any cases for deferral, but we do have some correspondence. We've got a request from the Hudson Highway Department. It's a request to release Belknap road fees. And they're asking for an interesting, actually, we need to amend the draft motion because the road agent has asked for the amount in the account or a larger amount if available at the time they withdraw it. So it would be to recommend that the Board of Selectmen release $56,272.48 or the current balance at the time the road agent requests disbursement of the funds. Anything other than what's in the letter?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Does anybody want to take a stab at the draft motion? Mr. Malley.
I move to recommend to the Board of Selectmen to release the release of $56,272.48 or the amount higher at the time of the release for the Belknap road fees, account 250-807, in accordance with the written request for the same from the Hudson Highway Department. Please see attached memo from Kevin Burns, road agent, Town of Hudson Highway Department, dated 25 April 2018.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Meinhold. Just for discussion and for the folks out in the audience, they are asking to disperse money collected for roadway reconstruction of paving of Belknap Road. The work schedule is estimated to cost $73,000. Currently, there's $56,263.42. And the Board of Selectmen extended the current paving contract with Brock Industries at their meeting on April 24th, 2018. And Brock's will be working under the direction of the road agent. Is there any further discussion?
How much are we releasing?
We're releasing the current balance, which is $56,272.48, or if there's a larger amount, because we've collected some by the time they actually ask for the check, we'll release the larger amount, up to the amount that they need for the Belknap Road improvement, which is $73,000.
Again, how much are we releasing?
We're releasing everything that's available in the account.
Wouldn't that be a better motion?
The same thing, means the same
know.
thing. We said, $56,272.48, or whatever the balance is, if larger, at the time the check's dispersed. So, basically the same thing. The other way would probably be shorter, but we've already got a motion written.
I understand that the only thing is that in the future, when somebody looks back, they're going to have to go into the accounting ledger to find out how much money was dispersed, not into the minutes of this meeting as to how much money was dispersed.
And, that's a very good point, when the money's dispersed, if you could have, either whoever disperses it or the road agent send us a letter, we'll put it into the record so it's in the minutes of our meeting. Good point, thank you. Always good to document things. We've had a number of things over the years, just for the, the public's amusement, that we have discussed where we tried to find out why something was done or how much was spent on something, and there were no records. The 800-foot gas station limitation was one of them. It wasn't that long ago, and nobody can remember why. Okay, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. We don't have any performance sureties, no ZBA input only, no old business or public hearings, no design review phases, no conceptual review only. We do, however, under new business / public hearings, have 24 Constitution Drive site plan, map 170, lot 034, SB number 0518. The purpose of the plan is to show a proposed one-story, 14,460 square foot industrial building and associated site improvements. Its application, acceptance, and hearing. Is the application ready for acceptance?
Mr. Chairman, the application is ready.
Very good. Do we have a motion to accept the application?
So moved.
Motion by Mr. Malley, seconded by Mr. Ullery. Any discussion? There being none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Good evening. Since you are here prior to the discussion of the actual discussion of this issue, we're on 24 Constitution Drive Industrial Building Site Plan Review. Mr. Dumont has arrived, so Mr. Vanderveen, would you like to be the alternate again this time? Sure. Thank you. So it's Mr. Meinhold and Mr. Dumont has been seated. Okay. You got here just in time because if he would have started his presentation, I would have been able to have you. What's that?
I apologize for that.
Not a problem. Things happen. Okay, would you like to state your name for the record, spell your last name, and give us your presentation, please?
Well, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, my name is Tom Zajac, Z-A-J-A-C. I'm a civil engineer with Hayner Swanson, 3 Congress Street in Nashua. Here tonight representing Printscape Realty on their property, 24 Constitution Drive. Also with me here tonight is the owner and applicant, Mr. Craig Norton from Princeton Technologies, and also Mr. Gary Thomas from North Point Construction. We're here tonight seeking site plan approval for a proposed 14,460 square foot industrial building along with associated site improvements. There's a couple plans that I've posted up here on the board. The first being closest to me is the master site plan, sheet 1 of 13, prepared by our office, dated February 26, 2018, with revisions through April 2nd, 2018. I also have 2 display plans, a rendered site plan in the middle, and also an aerial map up in the top left, both dated May 23rd, 2018, and prepared by our office. I do have an 11 by 17 of the aerial map. If anybody would like a copy of those, I'd be happy to to pass that around. Lastly, I have the proposed building elevations in the lower left-hand corner prepared by North Point Construction. So I'd like to just give a brief presentation, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Can you hold your presentation for just a minute? We'll see if Selectman Moran comes back and apparently had to take care of something very quickly.
Okay.
It had to do with next door.
Very possibly. Give him a minute, and if not, then we'll just continue.
No problem.
The plan you've got up there is dated the 23rd. When, do you know when the photo was taken?
I believe it's a Google Earth image from 2017. You can see the Bradley Tree site is under construction there.
Hmm.
I think that's my.
It's interesting what you can find on Google Earth. There was a recent internet video that went viral. A fella complained that Flying J truck stops weren't flying the American flag because they had complaints from non-citizens about the flag. Turned out it was one site which showed that there was no flag, but other Google Earth sites clearly showed there were flags flying, so the guy made a slightly incorrect assumption about what was going on.
Yeah.
Give him another 30 seconds, and if not, we'll continue, and if he's got any questions, he can ask you when he
No
gets back.
problem. It's a short presentation, so.
And this makes really riveting TV.
Yeah. Yeah, for those who are watching this channel and trying to decide if they should go to watch paint dry, it's a close second.
Just a warm-up for the Celtics game tonight.
There you go.
It better not be that dull.
You never know. My nephew was in a state finals in California in triple, 2A division. They were playing a small town in Northern California against the Compton Kings, who have a draw of about 2 million students to pick from, and they thought it was going to be a blowout, and little Redding, California kept them within 10 points. Now, that was a riveting game.
High school ball can be a lot more fun than pro ball.
Yeah, they didn't even have enough members for a full roster. They weren't quite playing Ironman, but it was close, and they still kept them to 10 or 20 points. Well, since he has not arrived, I don't want to delay you any further, so why don't you go ahead and continue?
Okay. So as discussed, the existing site is 24 Constitution Drive, map 170, lot 34. It's a little over 2 acres, located in the industrial zone. It's located within Clement Road Industrial Park, which is a designated revitalization zone by the state. We're abutted to the north and west by Constitution Drive, tree clearing business to the south, a residential open space lot to the southwest, and the Cyclones hockey rink to the east. The property is currently undeveloped and wooded. It contains moderate to steep topography with approximately 30 feet of grade change from south to north. Based on soil mapping and test pits performed on the property, the site contains well-drained soils with relatively shallow depths to ledge. Municipal sewer, water, underground gas, communications, and electric utilities are available within Constitution Drive, and the site does not contain any wetlands or wetland buffers. In 2005, this site was approved, site plan was approved for an approximately 10,000 square foot manufacturing building with associated loading and parking areas. The site plan and development agreement were recorded, but As you can see, the project was never constructed. It is now proposed to construct a one-story, 14,460 square foot building along with associated site improvements. The proposed user is Princeton Technology. They specialize in electronic contract manufacturing of electromechanical and mechanical products, including circuit board and cable assemblies. Princeton currently owns and operates a facility about 32,000 square feet directly across the street at 33 Constitution Drive. They also lease some short-term space elsewhere in town, but are seeking to open up this second facility to consolidate that and accommodate their growing business. This facility, when complete, will house 28 employees, and their hours of operation will be Monday through Friday, 6:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. As shown on the building elevations, the architectural elements include metal paneling and a low-slope pitch roof. Access to the site is provided via new site driveway off of Constitution Drive. Other site improvements include 28 parking spaces, 2 loading spaces, new curbing, sidewalk, utility improvements, on-site drainage, a stormwater management area, and new site lighting and landscaping. Upon completion, the site would contain approximately 62% open space, where 40% is required. Given the size of the proposed project and its intended use, we do not anticipate any impacts to local traffic or schools. I have in my presentation, I'd like to touch upon the 5 outstanding issues that were listed in the staff report. I do want to note that since the issuance of that staff report, CLD on Monday did release a second round of their comments dated May 22nd, 2018, and a large majority of these issues have been resolved, and their letter speaks to that. I also reviewed the remaining comments with George, and we're confident that the remaining comments in that letter are easily addressable. The first topic I want to talk about is the private covenants. I won't give you the full history here, but during our survey research, we came across private covenants for the original industrial park that was then revoked. The subdivision approval was revoked in the mid-90s. So as required, we provided copies of all this information, including the deed research, to the town and to CLD. CLD flagged it during the original review and asked us to kind of weigh in, and so our client sought a legal opinion that we have submitted for your records that essentially says that these covenants are no longer effect. The covenants had some restrictions in there that spoke to certain types of screening, which I think we've met, and it also spoke to no loading within the front of a site, which we have to an extent here, as we are on kind of a corner parcel. But our position is that those private covenants are no longer in effect. Our client has been operating the facility since the mid-2000s. He's never heard of such covenant group that would review projects, so I don't believe they're in existence, and those are in effect. The second item is the 100-foot residential setback from the open space property. I will read my waiver letter into the record in a moment. The third item is a stormwater design. So the original subdivision, when this was set up, included a drainage system that was designed to accommodate the runoff from the road, but also a certain allocation of runoff from each of these development parcels. And it includes a public drainage system in Constitution Drive that then discharges to a roughly 2-acre detention basin. If you look at the aerial map, it's just north of Constitution Drive. I've showed the approximate limits. It's a wooded detention basin. In the approved site plan in 2005 proposed to take all their runoff from pavement and rooftop areas and essentially just pipe it straight into the street without any formal treatment practice. And they argued at the time that the downstream detention basin had already been sized to provide to accommodate runoff from that development. During that 2005 plan review process, our office was involved in that project, so I did have a letter which was kind of after the approval where CLD was saying that they probably should have provided some sort of on-site treatment for the first flush or the 1-inch rain event. But ultimately, the plan was approved without any formal treatment. So we thought it was best that for the current project to kind of maintain a blend of the 2005 approval while also taking into consideration CLD's request to provide on-site treatment. So we're proposing a small rain garden in the northeast corner of the site that will provide treatment for runoff generated by our project. The result is that on-site treatment of stormwater will be a significant reduction in peak rates compared to the approved 2005 project. We feel like it complies with section 275-9A1 of the site plan regulations, which allows for an increase in runoff where an off-site drainage system has been designed to accommodate a site's drainage. And in CLD's latest letter, all of the stormwater related comments have been resolved. So I think they're comfortable with our approach. Fourth, I'd like to talk quickly about the driveway design. CLD had an original comment that was concerned about a portion of our driveway that was in the 8 to 10% range and requested a flat stopping area at our site driveway with Constitution Drive. Since that time, we have revised our site design to shift the building in a southeast direction, and also raise the site 2 feet. So what this did was it gave us more room lengthwise on that driveway and thus reduced the grades there. Right now, the majority of that 40-foot driveway has a grade of 6% or less, including 4% on the center line striping, so it's relatively mild. There is a section along the northerly curb that is still at about 8 to 10% right along that curb line if you measured it, but this is because we're trying to tie in a 4 to 6% grade to the existing road, which is 7.5%. So we feel like this design provides a safe and controlled approach to Constitution Drive. I also think that we need to take into account this portion of Constitution Drive, which is very close to the cul-de-sac dead end. So there's going to be very minimal traffic traveling along this portion of road. And I did discuss this matter with the town engineer, and he did not have any concerns about our design. Lastly, the cap fee, as CLD has, or the town staff has pointed out, we listed a warehouse rate instead of industrial on our plans, so we'll need to correct that amount, and that's acceptable to us. So, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I'd like to just read quickly my site plan waiver request. Letter dated May 4th, 2018. I'll try to paraphrase as best I can. This is related to the 100-foot residential use zone setback. As I mentioned, the very southwest corner of our property touches about a 43-acre wooded parcel, open space lot associated with the Kimball Heights 2 development. This lot is protected open space, and it serves as a natural buffer between the industrial park and the residential development. The open space lot provides approximately 500 feet of wooded buffer between the corner of our parcel and the nearest residence there. And we feel like although a portion of our parking is located within this buffer, we feel like we meet the spirit and intent of the regulation, given this existing buffer that will stay in effect. Moreover, the plan is consistent with both the overall character of the industrial park and with the 2005 approved site plan for the property. Limiting the property owner from making any improvements within this 100 feet would severely limit the use of the site. It is our opinion that the above waiver request is reasonable and meets the criteria outlined in this Hudson site plan regulations. In summary, I feel like this application is fairly straightforward. We're proposing an addition that's consistent with the original site plan, consistent with the office park, and we'll see an underutilized property in town be put to use. We've reviewed the staff report and the recommended conditions of approval, and all are acceptable to us. And if successful tonight, we hope to break ground sometime in mid to late June and hopefully complete the project before the end of the year. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you. Before we get to the board, I will open at 7:26, the public hearing. Are there any members of the audience who would like to speak in favor of this project? Is there anyone who would like to speak against or just has comments regarding the project? There being none, I'll close the public hearing at 7:26 PM. Members of the board. Mr. Ulrich.
Well, let's start with that wooded area that was just discussed, the 500 feet of wooded area. I'm not clear if that's part of the residential area or if it's a separate parcel from the residential area dedicated and unable to be modified or developed in any fashion.
Yes, my understanding is that development, there's 40-something lots in that neighborhood. So the lot, the open space lot that I'm talking about that wraps around these parcels, each of them would own a 1/40th, let's say, control in that parcel, but it being a conservation or cluster type development, I'm going to guess that area
It's
can
an
never
open
be.
space development, and that land is dedicated not to be built upon, so that they could put the
It's
houses.
essentially a conservation area that's controlled by those residents.
Just to make it crystal
It's a
clear,
separate parcel.
it's a separate parcel and there's no way under the covenants with the Kimball Hill development that could ever be built upon or a house be placed in there. So that is essentially open, preserved space.
That's my understanding.
It was actually part of the site plan,
Yeah.
not site plan, the subdivision plan.
Yep.
Good to get it on the record, though.
Yeah.
Any other members? Fairly straightforward plan at the end of a industrial end, yes?
Question for the fire department, there was a question in the CLD about fire protection in there. That's town water, so it's a, 8-inch main going in there, so they can use sprinkler for the building?
I would think the sprinklers would be required, but to answer that question, to get a definite, you should talk to them.
Deputy O'Brien has it noted in
Yeah.
there, that it will be sprinklered and fire alarmed connected to the town, so.
Right,
Yeah.
and due
I
to the
didn't see
size
that,
of the,
thank you.
due to the size of the building, it's pretty much required.
Any other questions? There being none, would someone like to take a stab at the, do we have the corrected amount on the cap?
Yeah, that's,
Yes,
We do. Okay, the cap in the draft motion to approve is correct. Mr. Malley?
So we'll do the waiver request first.
Sure.
I move to grant the requested waiver of HR 276-11.1.B 12C. No site improvements to be located within 100 feet of a residential district or property based on the testimony of the applicant's representative and in accordance with the language included in the submitted waiver request.
second.
It's been seconded by Mr. Ulrich. Discussion? Were all the people who live in the nearby residential, were they all considered abutters and notified?
Yes.
And none have appeared or written to the board. Any other discussion? There being none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Would you care to take a stab at the motion? Mr. Malley?
I move to approve the site plan entitled Proposed Industrial Building 24 Constitution Drive, Hudson, New Hampshire, for Princescape Realty LLC, 33 Constitution Drive, Hudson, New Hampshire, prepared by Hayner and Swanson, Inc., 3 Congress Street, Nashua, New Hampshire, dated April 2nd, 2018, with revisions through May 3rd, 2018, and consisting of sheets 1 through 13 and notes 1 through 23 on sheet 1. 1. All stipulations of approval shall be incorporated into the development agreement, which shall be recorded at the HCRD together with the site plan of record. 2. All improvements shown on the site plan of record, including notes 1 through 23, shall be completed in their entirety and at the expense of the applicant or his assignees. 3. Prior to the issuance of a final certificate of occupancy, an LLS certified as-built site plan shall be provided to the Town of Hudson Land Use Department, confirming that the site conforms to the site plan approved site plan. Yeah, I think I said that wrong, but. 4. A cost allocation procurement cap in the amount of $18,656 shall be paid prior to the issuance of a certificate of occupancy. Note 21 shall be revised to correct the amount based on light industrial use. 5. The on-site drainage system shall be constructed and maintained in compliance with the NHDES requirements for such system. 6. Prior to the planning board endorsement of the plan, it shall be subject to final review by town engineering and CLD. 7. Construction activities involving the subject lot shall be limited to the hours of 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. No exterior construction activities shall be allowed on Sunday. 8. Hours of refuse removal shall be exclusive to the hours between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday through Saturday only.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Actually, Mr. Dumont had his hand up first. He beat you by a nose. Seconded by Mr. Dumont. Is there any further discussion? There being none, all in favor of the site plan signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries unanimously. Very good. Nice use of that piece of property. You're welcome. Okay, other business. Under other business, we have 3 more. Land use guidelines. Would you like to? No, very good.
I like to keep it, yeah, I know. Actually, it might be one. Jesus.
Just push them.
I'll see you. Oh, yeah.
Can you pass those down?
Sure thing.
And for the viewing public, land use guidelines are a compilation of information related to the land use issue that is designed to provide needed guidance to town staff, applicants, and board members. Each guideline presents a summary of information contained in the zoning ordinance, land use regulations, and relevant state statutes that apply to that issue. The guide is also based on past decisions and practices of the board when reviewing applications and applying those laws to them. Finally, each guideline also reflects legal opinions and input provided to the board and town staff. Compiling all this information into one document will help participants in the regulatory process to understand its requirements and will help ensure that all requirements are complied with. Adoption of land use guidelines does not, however, limit the board's authority to deliberate on individual applications and come to potentially different conclusions based on the facts of those applications. Since state statutes frequently change, court decisions affect local decisions, and the community faces new growth, management, and challenges over time, each land use guideline should be reviewed and updated annually. Updates should also identify whether the amendments are needed for zoning ordinance and land use regulations. And that's the same for all 3 that we're going to discuss tonight, so we don't have to read that as a preface to each one. Mr. Theobald, would you like to explain the first one?
Mr. Chairman, members of the board, as we discussed at our last board meeting, we're looking at these land use guidelines. And last month, we reviewed the impact fees condominium review of subdivisions, or excuse me, subdivision review of condominiums. And then the third one was parking buffers and setbacks, like the one that came up in tonight's discussion. So I have forwarded those on to Attorney LaFever, and he has suggested adding an additional disclaimer statement, but overall, he was satisfied with the guidelines and did confirm a concern about the use of the impact fees for other purposes than for which they are collected. And I have forwarded that communication on to the town administrator for future reference, so that we will now have that in writing on record.
Good.
So tonight, as Glenn read from the staff report, we're looking at the land use guidelines as a process for hopefully bringing clarity and consistency to the land use decisions before the planning board, and that the guidelines would be established by what's in the zoning ordinance, what's in the land use regulations, thirdly, state statutes that apply to your decisions, past board interpretations, legal opinions that have been provided by town attorneys or the New Hampshire Municipal Association, the administrative procedures like the rules, the planning board rules and the zoning board rules would be another example of what guides the decision. And it's important to recognize that all of those 6 factors come into play, and they provide a framework for your decisions. And we've proposed this as a comprehensive approach to updating the zoning ordinance and the land use regulations. So as we're reviewing one of these policy issues, and we see that there's a need for change, we can kind of zero in on what that need is, and then what tools are available to fix it. So hopefully this approach to updating zoning ordinance and the land use regulations will be policy-driven rather than language-driven, where we zoom in and focus on the language. As I said, to try to identify the best mechanisms, I'm actually going to, in tonight's batch, have a set of recommendations on a couple of them, which will kind of get into this. And recognizing that, and again, this added language from Dave LaFever indicates that this does not in any way limit the discretionary authority of the board, but it should inform it. And the goal here is to provide common understanding to everybody involved in the process, whether it's the staff, the applicants, as well as the board. So tonight, I've proposed 3 additional ones that I've drafted. The first one being change of use reviews. And site plan approval is required for any change of use under Hudson's zoning ordinance. And the goal for that, where if anybody's changing tenants in one of the commercial property sites, the goal for that is to review it and make sure that the site is adequate and that there won't be impacts on the abutters of a new tenant moving in, which may be a completely different use with different impacts. But at the same time, there's a recognition that this can create a hardship for the property owner who's trying to lease the space if the potential tenant learns that it's going to be at least a month before they can even get an answer of whether they can move in or not, and there's no guarantee, then that creates some market risk for those, and for the tenants who are trying to arrange and close out where they are now. It creates both costs and probably as importantly, real estate transaction delays that can jeopardize the deals. So in recognition of that, the planning board has indicated in past decisions as well as discussions that the board would consider granting waivers of the formal site plan review application. You had a discussion and felt that it was important that the neighbors get notified and that there be an opportunity for discussion, but at the same time trying to help give some relief to this. Now, state law does provide for what they call or classify as a conceptual review of a project. And then under the state law, there's a separate phase written out, which is design review. And under the state law, the conceptual review is an opportunity for a developer to come in and meet with the planning board and discuss on a non-committal basis a potential project and aspects that might come up when they come with a formal application. There's no requirement for notification of abutters at that stage, And again, no official action can be taken by the board because there is no public notification requirement. We've been kind of merging the two and actually sending out abutter notices, but it's not in a clean compliance with the statutes on conceptual reviews. Design review goes a step higher and deeper, where you do notify abutters and you do make decisions about what plans and studies may be appropriate or could be waived. So I think where should head is somewhere maybe combining conceptual with design review with abutter notifications. And as I said, this is one of the guidelines that I've got some recommendations for you to consider. Purpose of design review is, as I just mentioned, determine what studies are needed. This is right in the state statute. Determine what studies are needed for a specific project review. State law allows the planning board to adopt site plan review regulations, and the planning board has adopted the regulations allow for waivers of the submissions, and we're proposing that be when, as a guideline, when there are no site modifications and no perceived impacts to the abutters or the public. And granting the waiver of site plan submissions would include, because this is a question, well, if I got the waiver, does that mean I'm actually approved for the change of use? We would spell that out in this guideline, that yes, it is included. So, some recommendations for this one, there are three. The first is to amend the Hudson Regulations, section 276-3, to specifically provide for conceptual and design reviews. There's nothing in the Hudson Regulations or the zoning ordinance that speaks to the issue of conceptual reviews. So I think it'd be good to codify that. Secondly, to combine conceptual and design review and entertain waivers that if you're proposing a change of use where there's no site change and no impacts are seen, the board would then consider granting a waiver of the formal site plan review process, and that we would use the conceptual review application form and the waiver request form as the paper processing of how we do these. Again, none of that is written down. I think it would be good to get that on the record and let everybody know that that's the way the process is gonna work. I'd be happy to answer questions on this one before we go on.
I'd like to just know what the board thinks about multi-tenant facilities, ones that change in and out quite frequently. If you have a building that, if you use like one of Seuss's strip malls, for instance, who's constantly year after year changing tenants as they come and go, does that need to come to us? If there's no exterior changes to the building?
That's actually come before us before, and the decision was, as long as it's a use that was approved for the mall in general,
Right.
then it wouldn't require coming back to us, because they've already got approval for a list of possible uses.
Well, normally, at least the way that I understand on those site plans, it doesn't say like a specific use per se. It has like a certain classification. Let's say there's retail allowed there, or it's, a commercial zone where within that zone it allows for retail, office space, on and on and on, endless amounts of, uses. If he's not making any changes to the outside of his building, do they need to come in front of us? If he has, like Donna's place over there, let's say she moves out and he moves in a karate studio, does that come before us, or does it need to?
Mr. Chairman, under the zoning ordinance,
It would
and
have
again,
to.
we have both the Hudson regulations, which are the site plan review,
Yeah.
and the zoning ordinance, and under the zoning ordinance, any change of use classification, going from residential to commercial to industrial, any land use classification, but within the land use classifications, if you're going from one category to another, like retail to a restaurant, you do have to come before the planning board for site plan review. That's in the zoning ordinance.
Right.
And that, I don't think you could change that without going to town meeting.
But to follow up on the question,
Yeah.
let's just use Donna's place as an example. And it wouldn't be smart because there's a bigger one across the street. But there would be no requirement for them to come in here and if Donna's decided to retire and put in a
Your sign.
karate judo there.
He would have to under that ordinance.
You would have to, even though there's no change. It's still
Yep.
within the classification of what that strip mall was allowed to do. So why would there be a requirement to come here?
It's the way the ordinance reads.
The way the ordinance reads, and these are each individual spaces, and if there's a change of use category within one of those spaces, then technically under the zoning.
No,
unless-
in the example given, there's no change in use. They're both selling a product.
Oh, I'm sorry. If they are within the same category, then that there is no requirement to come before
Well, let's
us.
say it's a different category, but within the same classification. So like commercial, you have so many different categories that you can have within that. If he changes from category to category that's still allowed within that zone, he would have to come in front of us.
No.
And
Yeah.
Mr. Malley, and then we've
The
got
way
a
the
comment.
ordinance reads, yeah. That's what I have a
I'm not
problem
100%
with.
sure, but I would believe that when the strip mall came forward, they allocated a certain amount of area for a restaurant, a certain amount of area for retail, and that was the basis in which the parking lot was created and designed. So if they go from, they have a restaurant on one end, and then they put a restaurant down the other end that was originally designed for retail, then it should come back before the planning board, because the parking requirements are gonna change.
But if you look at those site plans, that's not how they're laid out. They don't specify
They don't, and
uses per
in
unit. It
practice,
just shows unit numbers and how many's there.
Oh, the only one that I remember doing recently would be the Bacchus Road one. And they had allocated a certain amount of square footage for retail,
Okay.
and they had to do that not only for the sewer and for the water use being brought to the building, they had to allocate a certain space, square footage for it. And then that's how we based the parking.
now, in practice,
I don't think any of them
we've
will
got
ever come back.
Nottingham, and we've got the mall where Hannaford is, and we've got the mall where Donna's is,
And we got the 102 mall, and
the 102. And in practice, since I've been here, we haven't had, and there have been tons of change of use,
would never come back.
and we have never had one before us.
I don't see the need for it if there's no change on the outside of the building, because if there's no change on the outside, it doesn't change anything as far as the site goes. Like, if you have a unit that's 1,000 square feet, that person can only do so much within that unit, and it didn't change from the day that it was approved to now, in my opinion.
Yeah, what I think would be appropriate, based on what we've done in Hudson, would be to recommend a change to the zoning ordinance to specify that if the intended use doesn't increase the the requirement for the number of parking spaces, you know, if you went from an accountant to a donut shop, you might need more spaces, obviously. But there should be a change to the zoning ordinance to state that if there's no increase in traffic or parking, then it shouldn't come before us. Mr. Malley, then Mr. Collins, I think.
Then why would you require a change of use for anything? If the building and structure is already set up and the parking and they can conform to all those requirements, they're just changing use, then why should they have to come back and not the strip mall? But it's just because it's a single structure and not part of a large mall.
There's some point to what you're saying, but typically strip malls are designed with, the only way I can really articulate it is say floating parking spaces. The parking spaces don't really belong to any one store. So it's a little more fluid situation. On the other hand, if you had a strip mall that was all accountants and suddenly you're putting in all restaurants,
Right.
there would be an increase in
Be an increase in
requirement for
traffic.
parking, which means it should come back to us. But if the intended use doesn't increase the parking beyond the actual current parking, then probably it shouldn't come before us, because there's no real reason.
Right, but that would fall not only with strip malls, with
Every property,
every property. So now we're back to,
same spot.
we have to authorize the staff in town to make that determination.
Well, with strip malls, the parking's based on an average. With individual building, it's not based on an average, it's based on the actual intended number of spaces required for that specific use, as opposed to being watered down by a number of businesses that are fluid. So there is a difference. I don't know if it's a significant enough difference.
I guess for me to follow through and say, I don't necessarily disagree with the thought process, but I'd actually probably want to see one of the existing site plans and see how they actually calculated out the parking. And see if all of a sudden you're gonna go from 5,000 square feet of retail to 5,000 square feet of restaurant, how much is that gonna change the parking calculation? And if it falls in, then I don't disagree.
You know, if the board wanted to recommend that, I wouldn't be adverse to proposing it. So if a change,
We just did that with McDonald's.
we did that with McDonald's, what do we do with
At the
McDonald's?
at the Hudson Mall.
Mm-hmm.
We just did
Well,
discuss that issue.
They actually made alterations to the site, though.
Yeah.
They either decreased or increased parking, they added,
Signage,
they
Walkway.
added walkways for drainage, so that's a little different. I'm talking, you're just,
changing the name.
yeah, just.
Yeah.
Today Maui Electric's in there, tomorrow Geno's wants to move in there, you know. There's a huge difference between what
Mr. Collins?
I will move.
Doesn't the zoning administrator take a look at these applications for new businesses coming into town? And he makes that determination whether or not the use actually fits the site or the category in that part of town already. And usually in a mall, or a strip mall like that, you're not gonna have a manufacturing company looking to move in there, but you could.
Yep.
I think that would only, to me, that would signify a real change of use. You know, a flower shop moving out and a 3-seat hair salon moving in isn't, even though it's technically a change of use, I don't think that would require a site plan review, even though parking does play a calculation on the hair salon, right? Each one needs 2 or 3 spots per seat. But like you said earlier, the mall is kind of set up to handle that ebb and flow of traffic all day long when they design the mall.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we get involved in how many parking spaces we need for this business versus
Right.
that, we're gonna wind up telling businesses, don't bother, we're gonna make you come before us and spend hours and money and everything else
Right.
to allow you to go into business.
Well, the zoning administrator can just take a look at the proposed use and make a determination. There's tables that say, you know, if you're changing from a hair salon to a donut shop, what the change in parking is gonna be.
And some of this, if I might, if you, excuse me, Kim, when GNC went out and it was replaced by Cricket after several years, they didn't come before the planning board, and there's no real reason for it.
Yeah,
'Cause
not.
GNC was selling a product this size, and Cricket's selling a product this size.
And it went from essentially retail to retail.
Yeah.
There is
That's
no
the
change.
category, it's not what they're selling, it's retail sales.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter what they're selling, it's still retail sales. And I think we've had this discussion a few times with the prior chairman too. And I'm on the consensus being that when these malls are allowed to move in, you know that these businesses are gonna change fairly,
frequently,
yeah.
relatively.
Right, and anything that would require real site review would have to be a major change to the facility. Say, you know, a major food restaurant going in at the end of a mall, say the Hudson Mall. You know, that could change the parking calculations considerably. You know, when you have like a Buffalo Wild Wings, you're gonna have a huge increase in parking capacity or requirements. So, I don't know, I think we should just let the zoning administrator make those determinations at this point, like he's been doing, and if something that has to come before the planning board, I think it'll kind of show.
Yeah, the state law doesn't allow one staff member to make a decision on whether something gets approved or not approved, but one staff member can determine whether a change meets guidelines set down by the town. So if the town set down guidelines that say, if there's no significant increase in requirement for parking, then it gets approved. And that's not a decision by staff, it's simply a ministerial duty that he says, yes, it meets the, within the guideline, yeah. Someone would have to draft what that would say. Mr. Malley?
What?
Volunteering to draft what?
I am not volunteering to draft anything.
Except the beer.
Now you distracted me. Shiny light syndrome here. But under our current statute, the zoning administrator doesn't have the authority to.
Correct. No matter what they have.
Well, it's
So-
not,
so
we're
if you
not
were
giving
going
him,
to
we're not
draft-
giving him authority, what I'm suggesting is we don't give him authority to make, any decisions, other than, looking at an application, comparing it to a table of uses that shows parking spaces to say, no, it doesn't, meet any threshold to come before the board, or yes, it does.
Well, we can't do that right now, because the zoning requirement, the zoning ordinance requires every change of use to come before, under site plan.
That's fact number one on the guideline.
So if we wanted to change that, we would have to actually go to the town to
Right.
have them change that zoning
Yeah.
ordinance. But now my question is, how are you going to distinguish? There's so many different opportunities that could go into a strip mall. I mean, the guideline that you'd have to create for that, I'm assuming right now he looks at it, makes a zoning determination that there is an existing use allowed in that strip mall. So that's why they don't all come to us, or we'd be sitting here every night.
For nothing.
Yeah, so I mean, is the system broken, or is it working?
Or does it need to be codified as the,
I think it just needs to be amended.
Based on what limited experience I have, talking to staff, seeing situations, I think there are three reasons why you haven't seen a flood of these coming before you, given the current zoning ordinance. The first is that maybe the majority of the turnover in the malls has been within the same category, retail to retail, so none of those come. Secondly, there have been staff decisions in the past that said, this makes no sense to send this to the board, so they just basically looked the other way and didn't say anything. Third reason is that people have changed tenants without getting any permits or occupancy permits or approvals. So the staff has identified this as a problem in terms of what do we do with this, and every time there have been many, since I've been here, and it's not just the malls, it's like out by the former Pizza Hut, there's a couple of little office buildings there along Dairy Street, and the poor owner of the property comes in and says, I've got a tenant, and we say, well, you gotta go to the planning board for site plan review. They lose the tenant, the prospective tenant. So it's not, and they have limited parking, but it's kind of a mini version of the mall where you've got office to office, office to retail, office to personal services, very small spaces, but technically they have to come to the board, and the staff struggles with helping people understand that that's what they gotta do, and so it is a real problem. And that is what the zoning ordinance says. Now, in the last ZORC process, you discussed having a staff review committee to measure these things and see, does this really need to go to the board or not? And the consensus of the planning board last fall was to say, no, we're not gonna delegate that authority to the staff. So you still have that option. You could have a staff review these space-to-space changes, but that's where we would adopt a guideline to do that.
But under the current zoning ordinance, we can't do that.
Correct.
So we need to change it.
so it looks like you would need to change two ordinances.
Well, the zoning ordinance.
Change the zoning ordinance and then establish something that would, you would also need to put something on, future strip mall development that would, put that on the site plan, saying that any changes in tenancy,
Need to be reviewed.
Could you technically
Any-
do that under the minor site plan review to expedite?
Oh,
that would- oh, yeah.
It can be.
That's the same thing as what we're talking about with a conceptual review and waiving the site plan. It's actually easier to do this than to do a minor site plan, which is the full process.
because of the plumbing, the fire suppression, the EMS access, it's all done. because it was done for the entire building, not for this
I
tiny
like the
space.
conceptual, we've done a couple of conceptuals and they've flown through. Mr. Dumont?
I like the idea of the conceptual too. My only problem with the site plan review or the minor site plan review is if you take a guy like that, like you said, that small office building, and then you tell him that he has to go and create a site plan for that and spend $5,000, $10,000 to do that, even though it's only a minor site plan review, he's not gonna have the money to be able to do that. And then by the time that that's completed and he gets in front of the board, or even the minor site plan review, the tenant's gone. And I just
We've
feel-
had minor site plan reviews that were hand-drawn, so you don't have to spend that
Is
kind of
that
money.
acceptable, yeah?
No, under the regulations, they have to have a survey. This Domino's across the street
Yeah.
had to have a survey done.
Yep.
It took them like 3 months to get that resolved. And they have to have an engineer review it and prepare the site
If
plan.
they're doing
Something
changes
that's allowable.
to the site. If there, it's simply a change of use with no modification of the site, they don't.
6 months.
Yep.
And we have had, we had a minor site plan review for, the, kennel, the dog sales. That was very informal. There was no engineering review, there was nothing, because they weren't doing anything to the building other than making a few changes inside. But exterior, there's nothing. So that one went through and,
Just to follow up on that, I think that's one of the problems that we seem to have, is we have these ordinances that require certain things, then the boards just, they do what they want. It doesn't actually necessarily follow the ordinance every time, so I think it kinda makes us believe that, okay, well, this is allowable through the town, but the ordinance reads otherwise.
so we should change the ordinances to fit what we're doing.
Right,
Or at least adopt a guideline
correct.
that works within the interpretive authority of the board, so that you get a consistent result.
And to get rid of that gray area, there's no, you know.
Well, the authority of the board is set in Concord, not here, so.
Yeah. It's best to codify what you're doing.
Now, so under conceptual and design review, they don't have to have a certified site plan to do those under state law, or?
Correct.
Do they need it for design review? I thought,
Well, again, design review, part of it is coming in and discussing the design process.
and which our requirement for that would be site plan,
Yeah.
so.
Yeah,
So they
and
could do it on the back of a napkin, technically, if,
Well,
technically they could.
well,
but-
again, the concern that I am trying to address here is that conceptual review under state law says you don't make any decisions. If you grant a waiver of the requirement for going through site plan review process, you're making a decision.
Right.
The state law, and the reason that they prohibit it is because of the lack of requirement for public notice. If we go to design review phase, then technically that's what you're talking about. Do you need an engineered design for this site? So I think it fits.
so that's just a
And
changing
I think it
of
would be
word.
consistent with the state law. So this could be an interim process this year. See how it works, see if it does smooth things over. And if it works and people can get their, I mean, you meet every 2 weeks, so if they can get their reviews and not be delayed, get the waivers. Now, there may be some where they come in where there are issues, and you say, no, this has really got to go to full site plan review.
Just for the record, Mr. Ullery has to leave us at this point. 8:04. So you want to go with just the proposed guideline rather than trying to modify the ordinance at this point?
Well,
see how it
this,
works?
this does include recommendations to modify the Hudson regulations, which you have the authority to do after public hearing, as opposed to going to town meeting and changing the zoning ordinance, and try to figure out how can you have an ordinance that protects you in the mall, but doesn't require everybody in the mall. That's really complicated to do.
So you don't kill them all.
Right. Right, and Hudson has, I don't wanna bring this up because the bad reputation to do business in town, we don't wanna put that back on us. Right now, it seems like businesses are opening up in town, and I haven't heard of any real complaints of, you know, Hudson is a hard place to do business, so adding more, oversight, I just wanna make sure we're not burdening, you know, owners of small retail spaces with overly complicated, policies.
Well, I think that's what George is saying, is currently have an overcomplicated policy. and
Well,
I'd like to see us change it to make
When's
it
the last
easier.
time we had a change of use come in here for a store going into a strip mall? Are we gonna have to start reviewing every single case? I mean, is there any, you said, would you say 1/3 of the problem is these uses are taking place without anybody,
That's a part of it.
right?
Some number, I don't know how many.
Right? So wouldn't it behoove us to, as a town, to approach these changes or ask, at the administrative level, who authorized the change and stuff at that point? I mean, maybe good policing is a little better than,
Another way to handle it would be to modify the ordinance to say that multi-use site plans, also known as strip malls, do not require
additional site plan review.
additional site
Further.
plan review
Right.
if they're offering services or goods within the same category.
But then you're gonna have to go down through every category at that point, right?
Yeah.
And go, well, then now this type of use doesn't require that either if they stay within.
When a site plan for strip mall is granted, when it's approved, it should list the categories of potential tenants.
I think that's already listed. You have the zone, like I said, if someone builds a strip mall in a commercial zone and the uses are office space, retail, personal services, those are the uses that person's gonna be expect that they can do.
Mm-hmm.
And to make it harder for them to say, okay, well, here's what you can do, kind of, come in front of us and we'll let you know what you can really do.
It should say these are what's allowed,
Right.
and if you're doing one of these, you don't have to come back to us.
Exactly, and it would make it easier for the staff so they can say, okay, these are the allowed uses within that zone, and it is a multi-use facility. That's not gonna cause a big impact in a change in the exterior or parking or lighting or any of those big ticket items. I don't see why we need to see it. When
But it
realistically.
should be in the code.
Right,
That
yeah,
we don't
we
need to
would
see
need
it.
to amend
Yeah,
the ordinance.
and this gets back to the opening explanation that the guideline is based on the zoning ordinance, the land use regulations, past board decisions. So theoretically, if you were to review a mall and you had one of the tenants came in and we said, the staff level said, look, I don't have the authority, this is a change of use, or change of category. Bruce Buttrick says, I don't have authority to approve your change because you're changing the category within this space, within this mall. If that were to come into you and you were to review it, say through this conceptual review, the board could make a decision and make an interpretation that, look, for these malls which have an approved site plan where it's all the one big parking lot, it's not like you have, you might have a situation where you get some side parking, rear parking, but if it's just one big parking lot and you've approved it for retail X square feet, you've approved it for offices, second floor, square feet. So you have a site plan that you've approved that says this has adequate parking, the bufferings, everything's okay with this as a whole. Then you could make an interpretation to say, this doesn't require site plan approval. We don't have to waive it. This doesn't require it. So you could make it an interpretation, and as long as you're consistent in that interpretation, that for these strip malls, if they're just, it doesn't matter whether this space is retail, this space is personal services, if they switch, it doesn't change anything. So you could make an interpretation that staff would then put into the guideline, and we could even considerably do that as part of this workshop process, to say, here's a guideline, and here's how staff's gonna interpret it, because the board has looked at the ordinance, this is the language, this is the intent, and now we put it into a written guideline that now everybody is on the same page, that that's how we're gonna handle these malls.
So you'd have to do that for like those buildings over on, by the old Pop Pizza Hut. Would those be considered a strip mall?
Well, you could say, any multi-tenant building.
Yeah, so you wouldn't, that's what I was gonna ask, you just kinda generalize it to any multi-tenant
Yeah,
building.
we can do that through these guidelines.
So
I
we can
think-
make
I
it
believe.
declarative in the guideline that says.
Say, this is how the board is interpreting, but we have to make sure, and we'll have Dave LaFever look at it, to make sure that the language it can lead to that conclusion, which I think it
If
could.
he says it can't, we can modify the,
Then we have to go to the modification route.
okay, that sounds logical. But I think the consensus of the board is that changing a business in a mall doesn't really affect much of anything so far, and we've never had a problem.
Yeah, my only thing with that, I guess, is, like I said, are we gonna look at buildings and say, okay, so you have one retail space, one personal service space, and one office space. So you're allowed those 3 uses in that building, that's it. You can interchange or move people in and out. Or shouldn't it be looked at saying, like I said, that, that zone allows 10 uses? Those are the uses that should be allowed within that building. It shouldn't be limited.
But then you'd have to pick the highest parking.
Well, like we were talking about, the strip malls, you have tenants that, let's say you have a restaurant and a hair salon and, I don't know, an office space upstairs or something like that. You have one big parking area. There's not gonna be people pulling in all at the same time for those 3 tenants all at once. So that, those cars come in and out and they interchange, and like you said, you have overflow parking as well. So I really don't see the parking as a big issue. I mean, if you were to make the building larger, or bring in, more, or have more square footage, I would see that being
Or if you
a reason.
converted it all to all restaurants.
Right, but that's a site plan
Right,
change.
but I don't see,
Why is that a site plan change?
If he increases the size of the
if
building.
you increase the square footage, right?
But if you just convert it to all the restaurants, takes
But what
10,000
it-
square feet. and
No,
converts
right,
it all
that's
to
What
a
are the
site plan
odds, what are
change.
the odds that would happen, though? No strip mall would ever put in more than one restaurant. Normally, they all sign non-competes and
Oh, I was just up in Pelham, there was like 6 of them right in a row.
all in one strip mall?
Mr. Chairman,
Actually, it was Drake.
what
Sounds
I'd
like
offer
bad
to do,
business.
what I'd offer to do is draft a provision like the 1 through 7 in this, dealing with this, making a special provision for malls and multi-tenant buildings. And I'll work into it, if there's an approved site plan that specifies the uses within the property. Cause see, then what that would do is give the opportunity for the guy up near Pizza Hut, he's got 8 spaces in his building. He could come in and get a site plan approval for that would allow him to substitute the uses within his spaces, whenever he wanted to.
Yeah,
That's what they're doing with the Toll Street, the little industrial guy that's having all kinds of problems. They're in the process of doing that, and I think that would work.
The reason I don't think it's logical for having people come back to us when there's a change of use is that when strip malls are built and they're leased, no one ever comes to the planning board to say, okay, we built our strip mall, we're changing the current use from empty space to X, Y, and Z. They simply lease out the spaces the first time, and no town requires a site plan review for the first lease. So if we don't require it for the first lease, why should we require it for any subsequent lease?
Kids have to tell them
I
somebody
would,
owns
I
an
would think the
apartment
site plan
building,
got
hey,
to
every time you
those
change a tenant.
retail, certain amount of
Which is
square
what's
feet.
happened to that office guy that he's talking about.
So, for the next meeting, I will work on that, if that's okay.
Yes, have a site plan.
Great.
Very good. Number 2.
That's a big number 2.
All right, the next one is developments of regional impact. And the first of the iterations of fact that I put into the guideline is that state law requires local boards to determine the potential for regional impacts. And the statute, which is under regional planning commissions, which is why many towns miss this, there are 6 factors the state has said. Number 1, the relative size or the number of dwellings. Number 2, the proximity of the site to another community. Thirdly, the potential impacts on roads in the other community. Emissions such as light, noise, smoke, odor, or particles which could drift across into the neighboring community. 5th, the proximity to water bodies or aquifers so that the water flows into your part of the stream and then down into the next community. 6th, if there are shared community facilities such as schools and waste transfer stations, that would be the next area of impact. There has been at least one court case in New Hampshire where the language that says "and other similar factors" has to be similar to those. You can't just say, well, here's an issue that this legislature didn't think of, and so we're gonna make it a regional impact because of that. But if there is any question, the statute says if there's any doubt, you have to treat it as a regional impact project. And if it does have regional impacts, then you need to treat the abutting towns that are within the potential impact, as well as the Nashua Regional Planning Commission, as abutters. And you have to provide them with legal notice. As a practical standpoint, this board has been kind of making acceptance and approval in the same night. If it's a development of regional impact, that can't happen, because you're gonna have to notify, make the determination, notify the other town or towns, and notify NRPC. So you have to have, send the towns, affected towns, the minutes of the meeting where you determine that it's a project of regional impact. And then the plans must be sent to the NRPC within 5 days as well. From that point forward, they both must be sent abutter notifications. And that, as I said, requires at least one added public hearing. Now, the law provides that regional planning commissions can develop guidelines so that you can have a measurable set. For example, any commercial, some NRPCs have done, or RPCs have done, any commercial building over 50,000 square feet, any industrial building over 100,000 square feet, that makes it a development of regional impact. If you don't have anything adopted, then theoretically a 30,000 square foot commercial building could be perceived as and then they also have, within a quarter mile of the town boundary, it's helpful, and the state authorizes that a regional approach can be taken where all the towns agree, here are the parameters that make it, just to get consistency and make the process work.
Rather than having an additional meeting, if it met certain criteria, could staff simply, when they notify abutters, notify the other towns?
Well, you'd have to have an additional meeting for anybody to get notification. Or if you're gonna make the decision that night, see,
No, prior to that, let's say that somebody's gonna put in a convenience store 50 yards from a town line. Staff would say, okay, this is 50 yards from a town line, it could affect the next town over. When we send out the notice to abutters for the site plan meeting, we're gonna send out a notice to the adjacent town.
you can't delegate that authority to the staff. The board has to make a decision of whether it's a project of regional impact. The law says local land use board shall. The only staff member that's authorized to do this under the law is the building inspector.
Actually, we could.
Because if the planning board doesn't, and the zoning board doesn't, the building inspector has a delegated responsibility to make the independent determination that, yes, this is a project of regional impact, and I'm not issuing a building permit until the other towns are notified and have an opportunity.
If we made a decision as a board that all site plans within X number of feet of a town line are of regional impact, we've made the decision that anybody who comes before us now or in the future, we've already said, yes, that is. Why would we have to make an individual decision? Or would we? And then I'll take them.
Okay, I'll answer the question. Again, the law requires the board to make a case-by-case determination.
So the law does say case by case? Yes. Okay,
That's the problem.
that's clearer.
Yeah.
If we're just required to make a decision, we can make a blanket decision, but if it says specifically case by case, that's different.
The law delegates to the Regional Planning Commission the authority to adopt regional guidelines to help boards make the case-by-case decision. But I don't think you can delegate or adopt a rule that says all projects within this distance automatically have to go.
It would be nice if you could find out if we could do that. That would save a step for some that are just a ministerial decision. Okay, it's within a quarter mile, we should notify Litchfield.
When and if, as recommended, this goes to the NRPC process, that's something we can look at.
Okay. Mr. Malley, then Mr. Collins.
But just to go on the record, I would not support a blanket quarter mile from town line becomes a regional impact project. I don't think,
Well, I said that quarter mile is a,
I know.
just throwing it out, but
I wouldn't, I don't think I would agree to just place somebody into that position where now all of a sudden it becomes that, because
It's a small town.
And one of the case studies I'm gonna show, I think will make that point.
okay, valid point.
And although the town planner can't make that determination, he can
Point it
give
out.
us the information we need in our packets that would
Right.
point these conditions out.
Mhm.
So, it would help the board out immensely if the town planner at the time could look at something and say, this could really spike traffic going across the Sagamore Bridge, which would be a regional impact, a traffic increase
And if you'll notice.
from one
a-
community
a-
into the next.
A rather large apartment complex went in across a certain bridge, and I don't know if the town was ever notified.
I was just gonna say that.
It wasn't.
Did anybody receive notice about that monstrosity? No? No? Okay.
Gosh, that sounds like regional impact to me.
And if the town of Hudson had known about this law, you could have taken steps
Right.
to influence that project.
Yeah,
You still can't.
would have required another, it would have delayed them a week.
5 gallons
Uh,
of gas.
Mr. Vanderbeek.
Has the regional planning commission
What was
already
there?
have
Nothing
set of
skate park.
guidelines?
NRPC does
Yeah,
not.
it's just in all those junk buildings.
Let me just,
Traffic.
point out that some RPCs have, in New Hampshire, have adopted guidelines, but my observation is some of them go beyond what the law was intended to address. And so the recommendations I would offer you are to, one, add a step to the planning board and ZBA process so that this gets done, and it hasn't been done. Secondly, work with the NRPC, and I've already contacted them to develop a checklist with measurable indicators. And thirdly, make sure that that checklist is limited to the spillover effects and doesn't really try to adopt regional planning goals.
You know, a good point made by Mr. Malley, and a good point you just made in that last statement. Of all the plans that we've done in the last 2 years, within memory, can anybody think of one that might have required notification?
There was one that was going to come to you that didn't make it through the ZBA. Clearly, the Walmart and the Sam's Club would have, but that was back in the 70s, so that law wasn't in effect. But if those were to come in today, where they're located and the size of them and the traffic impacts, that would be, most inevitably meet the trigger.
Certainly it increased traffic going up
Now,
through
this parcel,
southern border.
this parcel right beside them is where the Bluebird self-storage was proposed.
Yep.
Okay? ZBA never discussed it. Is this a project of regional impact? Well, 100,000, excess of 100,000 square foot building could be, and probably, it should have at least been reviewed to make a decision. Now, the determination could come out to say, look, this thing only generates 10 trips a day. Even though it's 100,000 square feet,
It's storage.
it's not it doesn't have regional impacts. But you have to, under law, you have to make that determination. So if this had come to the planning board, and I wasn't aware of it, because there was no guideline to tell me that that was an issue, and it's buried in the state law somewhere. And, so I think this would be an example where you would go through the review process, and this is why you can't delegate it.
Yep.
Because you have to make a decision as a board, does this have traffic impacts? Does it have air impacts? Does it have water impacts? And it's your judgment call to say, and you can make a determination that, no, it doesn't have regional impacts, and therefore, we're not gonna send notices to anybody. And if you do that, and somebody challenges it, the court will say, they follow the law. And we're not gonna substitute our judgment for theirs, whether or not it should have or not.
Yeah, after Mr. Malley made his comment, I got to thinking about what we might have done in the past couple of years that would have triggered this, and I'm not coming up with any.
I got approved next to one.
Mr. Dumont.
So theoretically, then, like you said, it wouldn't be something that's even a quarter mile from the town line. It could be something that's smack dab in the middle of the town.
Right.
That could be a regional impact to everybody around.
Based on the size.
Right. Yeah. Depending
Pheasant
on
Run,
what it
Pheasant
is.
Run Mall,
Yeah.
no matter where that's located,
Yeah. Throw another Walmart in the middle of
it's
Hudson
gonna
would
affect
everything.
the abutting towns. And the Walmart too. Walmarts have huge draws regionally.
That Pratt and Whitney UPS building that we didn't get probably would have been.
Mm-hmm.
Anything with Green Meadows, that Green Meadows development.
Yeah, that Green Meadows would be one.
Although the
ever happened.
Pratt and Whitney one, the number of trips per day may or may not have required us to do it. It was a big facility, but not that many trips.
Well, like George is saying, it would have been worthwhile to look into it, and you can at least say
Yeah.
it was checked off.
Absolutely. You're
Okay,
required by law to make that review.
Yeah.
so it would be great if staff would
To add
notify
that
us to
step.
potential issues.
Good.
And if we come up with any of our own, and maybe we should put it in the packet, just as a note, this is of regional impact, this could be of regional impact, or this has very low regional impact based
Okay.
on staff opinion, that would be great.
Again, the second recommendation is to work with NRPC to develop a checklist with measurable indicators. And part of the reason for doing that is that other towns should have a say in this process of what you determine are projects of regional impact. So I've already contacted NRPC and triggered their thinking
Means
to do
we
this.
should have a decision in the next 4 years.
I don't believe so.
It worked pretty quickly.
Yeah,
You can
Well,
streamline it.
if it's NRPC doing it, but if you're asking other towns to give us input,
this would just be
That's-
NRPC. They would have a public process where
okay,
they,
if it's just
where they would
NRPC,
give other
then, yeah.
towns the
But
opportunity.
in the past where we've had other towns involved, sometimes the process takes a long time.
Oh, sure. As it would if you would wade in on Nashua's Renaissance project. Touche.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if it's all right with you, I'll move forward with that one.
Yes,
And the
That-
last one
that's excellent, by the way.
is, wetland buffers. I saved the most complex one for last.
Glenn?
Get ready, Bill.
So here are the facts, based on my review of the record and the regulations. The stated purposes of the Wetland Conservation District in the zoning ordinance are to protect wetlands and their buffers. But the current zoning ordinance wording requires buffers not just from wetlands, but from poorly drained soils that are not wetlands. That's what the regulations say. Bill, correct me if I'm wrong. Poorly drained soils are indicators of areas where wetlands are likely and where more intense soil surveying and wetland mapping are needed. That's why that language is in the regulation, the zoning ordinance, because hydric soils are not wetlands, but all wetlands are hydric soil, have
Right,
hydric soils.
it has to meet all three
Three
criteria.
indicators, right.
Yeah.
Soils,
It could be a wetland.
soils, hydrology, and wetland vegetation.
Wet.
Yeah.
Hydrophilic,
So here's here's what is intended by the language that's in the current ordinance, but it doesn't come out that way. The intent is that the county soil survey, which identifies general areas of poorly drained and very poorly drained soils, those are the areas, if you have a project that comes before you, you require a high-intensity soil survey. And if that shows the hydric soils, then you do the wetland delineations. And then wherever you have mapped wetlands, you have the 50-foot buffer requirement. That's the sequence that's intended, and that's general practice everywhere. But the ordinance was drafted in such a way that the hydric soils actually require the 50-foot buffer. And that's gotta be changed.
yeah, it should be all three. Poorly
Poorly-
drained or very poorly drained, hydric soils, which are typically oxidized soils,
So,
and
yeah.
hydrophilic plants.
so this guideline, for the record, so that everybody understands how Hudson is doing this under this current ordinance, we're interpreting that poorly drains are part of the Wetland Conservation District for identification purposes only. They do not require a 50-foot buffer. The town engineer, the Conservation Commission, the zoning board, the planning board, nobody has ever applied what's in the regulation. Because it just wouldn't make any sense whatsoever to do that. So here's the map that NRPC prepared for me within one day, Glenn. Took them one day to get me this map.
He's got some swag.
Pleasantly.
Okay, so this is based on, these dark brown are the poorly drained, and these kind of tan are very poorly drained, and you'll see there's wetland within this, but technically, under the current ordinance, this entire area would require a 50-foot buffer. And you can see, so you have wetland, you always have hydric soils, poorly drained, very poorly drained with wetlands, but you can have, as you see over in this area, you can have a lot of poorly drained soils where you don't have the wetland, under Army Corps of Engineers.
Could you
So-
pull up the regulation as it sits
And it's
today?
like right next to it. The
You have a
limit that's
copy of
what it
that?
is here.
I've got a copy right here.
That aren't here in town or not on that map.
You know? On our site plans, the buffers are all there.
Yeah.
I think it's section 12.
For drainage.
It is. What in particular did you want to look at, Glenn?
Just what the actual wording is, to
Okay,
see
the
what,
wording is.
what we need to change.
Rods and Pond.
All right, the Wetland Conservation District is defined as all wetland areas, surface water bodies, and areas of poorly drained or very poorly drained soils, and the associated wetland buffers as defined above. Then, if you look at the definition of wetland buffer, is a zone of non-interference extending 50 feet from the edge of a wetland area or area of poorly drained or very poorly drained soils.
So that
Yeah,
needs to
that needs to be amended out, because a clay pit is
Yeah.
poorly drained soil and it has nothing whatsoever to do with the wetland.
Well, typically, when there's a question in regards to wetlands or wetland buffers, you have a trained,
Wetland,
wetland scientist.
right,
Surveying the property, and he delineates any areas that meet the wetland criteria.
and that's
As
as,
defined by the state.
that's as it should be, but
Right.
our ordinance says any
And you
poorly
can
drained
be
soil.
more restrictive than the state or the Army Corps of Engineers.
I
And
think,
this is
Right.
far more restrictive.
yeah, this is, typically, theoretically, if you had, a layer of 6 inches of loam over ledge, you've got poorly drained soil,
right.
even if you're upland.
Okay.
Everywhere.
But it-
That's-
But it doesn't, I guess, what are you trying to do here? What's your end goal on this one?
The angle is, let's adopt a guideline that clarifies that we don't require buffers from poorly drained soils, even though the ordinance says
Only
it.
poorly drained soil.
But who makes that determination? Who's
If,
gonna make that determination?
When it goes before the Conservation Commission, to the ZBA, to the Planning Board.
Through a wetland scientist?
Yeah, wetland scientists will say, these are the wetlands,
Right.
and then based
Because
on
there's
that,
more to, there's more to wetlands than just the body of water that sits there. Even in
Right.
poorly drained soils, it could be, wet 2/3 of the year with plants and everything else that can be associated
and that
with
would
wetlands.
qualify, and
Right.
a wetland scientist would be able to tell us that, but if the only indicator is poorly drained soil with nothing else, no hydrophilic plants, no standing water, no oxidized soil, then that wouldn't require buffer, because it's just a chunk of wet soil.
Then the scientist would say that.
But our ordinance doesn't let
it's not
them.
what the scientist says, it's what the lawyer says.
Right.
And the lawyer for the abutter who doesn't want to see a subdivision happen is gonna say, look, I don't care what the wetland scientist said. This ordinance says you need a 50-foot buffer from all poorly drained soils. This doesn't,
Whether or
meet-
not
this
it's a
project
wetland.
doesn't meet your standards.
Mr. Vanderveen, then Mr. Dumont.
Hey, just for the record, I don't think I've ever seen a site plan with a 50-foot buffer around poorly drained soils.
Never.
It's just on,
No,
yeah, it's
right.
just on the wetlands.
Right.
So the ordinance is beyond what we actually do in practice.
Right.
So
It should be corrected to
And
be
there's always a
reality.
wetland scientist involved in determining where the wetland is. According to the ordinance, we ought to send him out or her out to go find the poorly drained soils and mark those off on the site plan as well, and we're not doing that.
And you
No,
could.
no, he does a site survey.
Yeah.
And he determines where the wetlands exist, where the buffer should be.
It'll also show
But according to the ordinance, his marching orders ought to be go find all those poorly drained soils too and mark that.
And let me
We'll
just
label those.
explain that you could theoretically have a rationale
and then just buffer, right?
for requiring a 50-foot setback from poorly drained soils, because areas that are flat with poorly drained soils, you end up with all kinds of basement foundation drain problems. There's no positive drainage. Everybody has sump pumps.
I know several of those.
There are towns that have said, look, we do not want development in these bad drain areas because it's just a mess. And the town ends up with all the complaints and the problems. And so most towns wouldn't do that, but theoretically you could make an argument why you would have a 50-foot setback from poorly drained soils.
The other thing with that is that that's just something that you can take care of on the construction basis. If you do drainage around the house in the basement, that takes care of that issue of stone and pipe, and that kind of gets rid of that. I think that's just more on, the construction side of it.
It can.
Yeah, it can, right, yeah, obviously, no matter what, problems can occur. But as far as I think everybody's on the same page. The way that we're doing it is right. We require a buffer for wetlands. We don't require it for poorly drained soils. So I think we just need to make the amendment to the ordinance to get rid of that. So that way, when the wetland scientist does his work, he doesn't have to worry about filling out the paperwork for those poorly drained soils. He can just go mark out his wetlands. If he needs a buffer, he puts that in. If not, we move forward.
And I do have the recommendation for that.
Yeah,
Perfect.
and we use the. Army
And
Corps
let me
of
show you
Engineers.
another area that I'm sure you're not aware of because you're not doing it. And that is, and I'm reading you from the ordinance. The zoning ordinance. Permitted uses. The following uses shall be permitted in the Wetland Conservation District, subject to review by the Conservation Commission, Planning Board, and the zoning administrator. Permitted uses are allowed subject to review by the Conservation Commission, the Planning Board, and the zoning administrator. So what that's saying, if you take it literally, not just special exceptions to cut into the buffers, anything you do has to go to the Conservation Commission, the zoning board, and through the zoning administrator. And the permitted uses are forestry and tree farming, agriculture, water supplies, wells, public and private, and conservation areas. So this guideline says you can do it, you just have to follow the best management practices. We're not gonna issue permits for it, and you haven't been. So this guideline will say that's what the policy is. And again, I'm recommending that you amend this to say that, just so there's no question legally. And last year, there was a discussion of adopting conditional use reviews for wetlands and have the planning board do it so that you don't have to go to the Conservation Commission, the planning board, and the ZBA. Special exceptions, intrusions into buffers require ZBA approval with recommendation by the Conservation Commission. And I'm proposing a change that drops the planning board recommendation in the special exception process. The reason being, and also, let me make note that the Conservation Commission may require field markers for wetland buffers. That's only been done on 2 projects, Sparkling River and Laurel Landing. The planning board reviews wetland impacts during site plan review and subdivision reviews. The planning board is gonna look at the issue. Now you look at it twice. You look at it as a recommendation to the Conservation Commission recommendation to the ZBA if they're gonna be doing any intrusion. Then when the subdivision plan comes in for subdivision review or site plan review, the planning board has the opportunity to review the site land, the wetland impacts. And it may well be that during your design review, you require changes for parking and other things that now changes what the impact on the wetland's gonna be, either more or less. So this process right now is very onerous to send people to 3 boards on the wetland.
We only need one bite of the apple.
They actually only they go to the ZBA. The Conservation Commission gives them input on because it's only advisory.
Right.
Gives them input on the wetland special exemption. That special exemption, I think I've only seen it once appear in one of our packets at the planning board.
We've
That
had,
was only for the
we've had
the
ZBA,
development off of the Gowing Road
We've had ZBA input only, 5 or 6 times since I've been here, maybe more.
Right.
It has been a lot of times, but every
Whenever-
time we've
whenever
done
the
it, we take a
ZBA
look at what the,
does a wetland impact, it's required.
yeah.
Yeah, it comes before, yeah. What's that? Say that?
It said, based on the record that I reviewed,
Right.
every time it's ever gone to the ZBA for wetland special exception, it's come to the planning board for recommendation.
Oh, yeah, I've never seen it come into our packet, other than maybe once or twice, as part of the review process for that site.
It's,
And what that's doing is giving us 2 bites at the apple, and we only need 1.
Right, right, and such as the planning board members going out for a conservation commission or a wetland special exemption site walk. I've never seen any planning board members come out for the site walks either, in my tenure on the conservation commission, so. Yeah, it's. Huh?
Give me a four-wheeler, I'll go.
Have we been notified? How did we get notified of that?
You're supposed to be notified, through the chairman, you know, so.
Chairman's never
Not
notified.
not the, not that. the
Not that
Conservation
chairman?
Commission chairman should be notifying when the
Yeah.
sidewalk is.
Never been
We've been notified, like I said, 4 or 5 times.
It's a broken system, I will grant
Yeah.
you that. You know,
here's
But-
another broken part, is the requirement for added setbacks for septic systems. Staff just goes by what the state law says for setbacks, but the regulations say different, and that should be changed. The town defers to the state on wetland setbacks for septic systems, and the town also defers to the state. These regulations suggest that the Conservation Commission can get into negotiations with developers on wetland mitigation.
Right.
So if you're gonna impact 5,000 square feet here, you gotta create wetlands somewhere else, 5,000 square feet. The state does all of that, and they have the expertise to do it. To have Hudson's Conservation Commission negotiating that, unless you have a wetland specialist on staff, probably not a good idea.
And the way I would word that, if you wanted to go to the town, for the vote, would just be to say that, for this section, this section, this section, this section, that the town is going to defer to the state standard.
So let me go to I'll jump over some of the more details just to go to the recommendations. Number 1, amend the definition of wetland buffer and wetland conservation district to clarify that buffers are not required for poorly drained soils. That's an amendment to the zoning ordinance that should go to town meeting. Secondly, amend the zoning ordinance to clarify that permits are not required for permitted uses, but they must follow the best management practices. Thirdly, amend the zoning ordinance to eliminate planning board input on wetland special exceptions, recognizing that the planning board will review it at the site plan and subdivision stages, which would cut out one step in the process. And then fourthly, repeal the added setback standards for septic systems and amend the zoning ordinance to follow NHDES wetland alteration rules, which is what you just mentioned. So that's what's in the guideline.
Actually,
With-
4 and
with
5 would be
recommendations.
deferring to the state.
Absolutely, yeah.
I like it.
I think that's it.
Anybody have any more
No, I'm good with
comments
that.
on that?
Okay,
My only concern would be the first one, with the, who's gonna determine the setbacks, who's gonna determine,
For,
poorly drained
it
soils.
should say,
Yeah.
I would add for,
They-
amend the definitions of wetland buffer and wetland conservation district, clarify that buffers are not required for
poorly drained
for
soils.
only poorly drained soils. So if it's poorly drained soil and the other 2 components, then it does require a setback, but not just because it's poorly drained
Well,
soil.
the ordinance,
Right, you have to determine what that poorly drained soil really is,
Right.
you know what I mean?
Well, they did that with the soil
Vernal
test.
pool disappears throughout the summertime, but reappears back in the spring or in the winter
Right,
time,
but it
you
has
know what I mean?
oxidized soil, it has,
Well, I
it's poorly
understand that,
drained
but
and it has
somebody
hydrophilic
could take
plants.
somebody could go out there and just say, no, that's only just poorly drained soil, so, let's go with it, so.
vernal pools are a separate class.
Well, I understand that, I'm just using it as an example, but when they dry up, somebody could just say, well, it's just a little muddy
Yeah.
patch of soil, you know,
But-
so.
Is the somebody the wetland scientist? Because he's making the determination.
That's what I'm getting at, who's gonna make these decisions?
This doesn't
as
change
to
that.
What is determined just to be poorly drained soil on a project and, or not, you know what I mean?
The subject matter expert is the scientist.
Is the
correct?
wetland scientist.
There are two scientists involved. First is a soil scientist,
Right, well, we're not changing
and
that at all.
then there's
That
a
has been the way it
wetland
is.
scientist.
That's the
Yeah.
recommendation.
That's right, not changing that.
So we're not removing their input in the process at all.
Right.
So that's all, yeah, so that's,
wetland, just poorly drained soil.
nobody's changing any definitions or anything.
Yep.
Really.
Okay, so, if you're okay with me moving this on in the process, what I'll do is draft that provision for multi-tenant and malls on the change of use, and send the others on to, Attorney LaFever for review. I'll bring in the first three next time for approval. And then after the legal review, we'll bring these back for your review, final review and approval.
Okay.
And move on to the next ones.
Okay.
How many of these do we have to do?
We've got about
400?
16 or 17 in the pipeline.
I'm sure we could find them.
Good stuff. This one is, actually very, very nicely done.
Are those Chippewa? What are they? Chippewa, yeah, right.
Gotta go with the American made.
Yeah,
They're still American.
things that need to be fixed.
Mine have fallen apart.
Oh, yeah.
Ancient.
Okay, one last piece of business. Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
Were you seated or was I?
Motion carries
You were seated.
unanimously.
I was
Thank you very
removed.
much.
I was-